Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 7 of Rock Music History and Appreciation. I hope that you are all doing well. I can't believe that it's October, but that's how the days work and time works. So here we are, looking forward to fall, looking forward to chillier days and all the good things that fall brings. So last week you learned about the start of the British invasion. You learned that basically the British invasion was the opening of the floodgates, if you will, for British artists to the United States, and that was really that was led and created by and because of the Beatles in 1964. And so then you also learned about the Rolling Stones, and you learned about how important both of those bands are, and hopefully you learned why the Beatles are really the most important band ever. Right place, right time, all the right circumstances. That what they did in those 7 years was pretty remarkable. And I've commented many times over the years that bands that come out, a lot of them have to kind of wrestle with the Beatles in one way or another, even new ones. And my sons and I last night, we were listening to one of the new Arctic Monkeys songs, and it has there's a Beatles influence vibe in there. They are still formidable in terms of a lot of artists that are like, that sets the gold standard, and that's what they want to do. So this week, we're going to talk about the continuation of the British invasion, because we just focused on the two kind of main bands. And then we're going to talk about the British blues revival, which really is, it's kind of a misnomer, because it's not a British blues revival. It's a British revival of American blues. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll talk about the impact of what happened here in the United States as a result of this. And I want you to make sure that you're paying attention in the video and in the materials, because you're going to be asked about that, okay? You're going to be asked, and people sometimes they misread the question or they don't pay attention. I'm going to try to use this video to clarify. So first of all, we talked about the Beatles, and I realized in my video last week, I started to explain how I do this diagram, and so you have Elvis, and then I never went on to really fully explain what the diagram was. Now, if I had really been on my game, I would have drawn it out for you and held it up right now, but I wasn't really on my game, but I can't explain it, which is basically, you have the history of pop music, blues, jazz, folk, all that, country, all that stuff, and then you get to Elvis, right? And Elvis everything coalesces there. So Elvis would be like at the top. He's the main game changer. It changes it for everybody all the way through. So you wouldn't probably have had the Beatles had you not had Elvis, okay? Then you go through all the other ones, and it's not that the other ones aren't valuable or meaningful, or they didn't create great music, but they aren't the significant game changers. And again, that's a point that I bring up in this class, which is that you'll find that bands and artists that you love and whatever get left out. And it's not because they're not good bands or artists. It's not because they didn't write great songs or whatever. It's because maybe they didn't change the game. And we've got to focus on those game changers now. So we talk about the importance of Elvis, and then we talk a little bit about, the importance of Buddy Holly and Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins, but they weren't really the game changers. Elvis really changed that game. So you have the Elvis, and then you get to the Beatles. See, I was thinking that's where the came from. So you have the Beatles, and Elvis was the most important single artist. The Beatles were the most important band. And then because of what the Beatles did, so you imagine Elvis, the Beatles, and you're going to put a little side tangent here with the Beach Boys, because the Beach Boys were a significant impact on the Beatles. Aside from being as popular on their own, they really impacted the trajectory of the Beatles. And as you learned in the last class, hopefully you learned this, we have another game changer that would be kind of around the same time, which is Bob Dylan. So you have Elvis, and then you have the Beatles and Bob Dylan, with this little influence of the Beach Boys coming in and weighing in. And we'll talk about Bob Dylan next week. And then with Bob Dylan influencing the Beatles and the Beatles influencing Bob Dylan, but then you also have underneath the Beatles, it starts to spread out like this, and you have the Kinks, the Who, and the Rolling Stones, and then to a lesser degree maybe the Animals and some other people like that. So last week was about the Beatles and the Stones, and now we're going to talk about some of those other bands, and we're going to talk about the impact that that they had, and it was less than what the Beatles and the Stones arguably did. And there's an interesting reason for that, which is that one thing when you think about the Beatles, if you go back and you listen to the Beatles catalog from 62 to 70, which is when their last album came out, even though they were done as a band in 69, there's a huge, diverse musical palette that they are drawing from. So there are so many different styles from folk and classical influences and rock influences and all sorts of influences that come in. Just listen to, world music, Indian music. Just sit down and listen. If you have not done this yet, by the way, I really would love for you to sit down and listen to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And I mean listen to it. So back in the day when I was young, when a new record would come out, we'd be very excited. And we would bring that record home. And by record, I mean vinyl, right? An LP. And then we would put it on and we would listen to it. And maybe we'd read the liner notes and we'd read who wrote what and who produced what and all these different things. But we would actually sit down and listen to the music. And I used to have headphones for for the stereo that I had back in the day. And I would put on an album and I would just sit and listen to it and listen to the music, the art that was created. Okay? So if you've never done that, do that. And I would particularly challenge you to do that with Sgt. Pepper's because it's an incredible experience. If you can listen to it with headphones, listen to it with good headphones, not like AirPods, but try to listen to it with something better. Or whatever, ideally stereo is better, even though it was mixed back in the day, both mono and stereo. But listen to it from beginning to end. So the thing about LPs back in the day was that, you'd listen to side one, you'd have to get up and flip it over and listen to side two. And the artists back in those days knew that. And they actually tracked albums, curated them in the song orders, knowing that there would be that break. That made CDs such a big deal because CDs, you didn't have to flip that. So everybody was in heaven because we didn't have to do it. But back in those days, in the 60s, 70s, you had to do that. So I challenge you to sit down and listen to that diversity of style. No other band has ever had that diverse in terms of their internal, what they created. The only band that gets close is Queen. Queen is the only other band. And there's a good reason why for both of those cases. In the Beatles, you had 4 songwriters. Granted, Ringo didn't write as much, and George didn't write quite as much. But you had 4 songwriters that were all creatively providing input. If you haven't watched that Disney Plus documentary, watch it, and you'll see it. Same with Queen. Queen had 4 writers. And so when you have 4 writers that are bringing in their own material, they are going to be coming from a lot of different places. So the Stones only had 2 writers. The Kinks had 2 writers, and The Who had 1. Pete Townsend, who's one of my favorite artists, and I will tell you right now, and maybe there will be a question that pops up later in this video, that I love all the British Invasion bands. I listen to them all, but my favorite is The Who. Now, does that mean that I think The Who was better than the Beatles? No. It's certainly not more impactful. The Who just happens to be my favorite one. Okay, so I can easily sit down and discuss the impact of the Beatles and all that, and I love all the Beatles music too. But so that's one thing that I wanted to point out. So as we move into this, you're going to learn about the Mersey sound, which is something that the Beatles influenced, and you're going to learn about Herman's Hermits, and you're going to learn about the Hollies. Herman's Hermits, you're going to get to hear I'm Into Something Good, which is just one of the greatest happy, peppy songs ever written, and it's a cover song originally by Carole King, but you're going to learn about that, and then you're going to learn about this thing that existed over in England where you had the mods and the rockers. And I maybe talked about this a little bit in the last video. The rockers were the people that were into, and this wasn't just bands, this was a social thing, right? So the rockers were influenced by American rock and roll. So they drove motorcycles, they would wear, jeans and leather jackets and t-shirts, and they would listen to American rock and roll. So they were listening to Elvis and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and all that sort of stuff. That's really what they loved. Then you have the mods, and mod was short for modern, and mods, they liked what they considered more modern music, and it was actually a wider palette musically. So the mods liked soul, they liked R&B, they liked some of the pop stuff that was coming out of the US and all that. They had a different feel, and there was a whole scene. And mods typically drove scooters like Vespas, and you would often see mods wearing suits, skinny ties, all that. And there was a very different culture, different drugs connected to different cultures, all that sort of stuff. And there were a lot of like battles between mods and rockers. If you don't know the Who's Quadrophenia, it's kind of, that ties into that whole story. And I won't get into all of that, but that happens to be one of my favorite albums ever. So you're going to learn about the mods and the rockers, and then you're going to learn about the Kinks and the Who and how they tied into the mod scene, at least for a while, and then how they went and kind of did their own thing. And so it's very interesting because you have the Beatles, and had the Beatles not broke, we probably wouldn't know about the Stones, the Kinks, or the Who. Then the Stones, the Kinks, and the Who had an impact, lesser impact than the Beatles did, just sort of globally on music, but they definitely did have their music. And their influences that went out. The Kinks is probably one of the most covered bands out there that people don't realize their songs were originally Kink songs. The thing about Kink songs is, and maybe to a lesser degree, Who songs, is that they definitely came from a more English perspective, especially the Kinks in terms of subject matter. So there are things that Ray Davies would write about that you wouldn't maybe necessarily get if you weren't English, because you sort of had to be there, right? You had to live there and know that, okay? So you have all of that, and you're going to learn about those bands, and then you're going to learn about what the book calls the British Blues Revival. And like I said a few minutes ago, it's really the British revival of American blues. So in short, what happened was there was a small and very devoted, loyal group of people in England that loved American blues. So they weren't into the rock thing. They weren't into the mod thing. They actually jumped earlier. They went back to the roots of a lot of this, and they loved American blues. So they loved Robert Johnson, Son House, Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, right? All of those guys. They loved the early blues roots music, and they were fanatical about it. And some of them formed bands. And some of them formed bands with their sole goal to just play American blues. Not to be music stars, not to have some big career, but to play American blues and to play it as authentically as they could. Okay, so that was a lot of their goal. And out of that's where you get Eric Clapton and other people. So this was formative to the Rolling Stones early on, and then other groups as well. So you're going to learn about a couple of the important bands that were related to this. And there were a couple. I'm not going to go into all of that. You're going to have to read about it in the book, that were really significant as sort of breeding and training grounds for these musicians. And because of them, some of the American blues artists started to have a revival in their career. And when they would travel over to England, these British musicians would often back them up. And so, and even some of the rock guys. And so you're going to learn about that. So that's the English scene, right? And because of that, they sparked this resurgence of American blues artists and brought some of them back into another wave of their career. And then some of these bands ended up becoming big in their own right. Now, all of these bands that we're talking about here, they all started off as cover bands. You don't learn to be a band by sitting down and just figuring it all out. It's such a different world now with YouTube and with all that other stuff. But back in the day, also 99% of all these folks couldn't read or write music. Pete Townsend could a little bit. John Entwistle could. We'll talk about some of the Zeppelin guys later. But most of them couldn't read or write music, so you would learn by listening to the records, learning the songs, copying them, and then playing them live, because that's how you got out there. And then that's how they would do it. But what they started to realize, that if you were only doing cover songs, you weren't going to have a career as an artist. You had to start writing your own songs. And then if you're writing your own songs, of course, you're going to have your influences, but then you also want them to be you want them to be popular. And so when you look at the trajectory of some bands like the Hollies and things like that, you'll see how this goes. And of course, Eric Clapton's career, as he moves through a number of bands and then eventually becomes a solo artist. But you're going to learn about the impact of that, particularly with Cream. But he was in a number of bands, and you're going to see how these are all really tight and closely related. So now you have this British invasion. It becomes huge. It actually changes the landscape over here in the United States, because the Beatles and the British artists are so big, they're getting a lot of the radio play. Now, again, remember, Motown is still big here. The Beach Boys are still big here. Bob Dylan is still big here. So it's not like it's either or, right? It's and. And so, but the Beatles in particularly were dominating the charts for a big chunk of this, and some of the British artists. So the Americans had to respond, and they did in a couple of different ways. One of them was that the American businessmen, saw what was going on with the Beatles, and as you learned about, the other thing, just like with Elvis, movies were very popular with in terms of the success of the Beatles, and then TV. As well, to a lesser extent for them, but then TV became a huge medium, really specifically in the '60s, and so these American businessmen had this idea, and basically what they did was they created a fictitious band called the Monkees, and they put out casting calls for actors, and then they got kind of lucky because some of them already played music, and so but the Monkees were not a real band to start out with, and they had other artists that wrote for them, and so some of the early Monkees songs that were written by other people, and it wasn't until a little later in the Monkees group. But the Monkees were huge as well. So when it comes to popularity, sometimes you'll hear people say, who was better, the Beatles or the Stones? And that's like a totally unfair comparison, because they're two totally different things. That's like saying which is better, cauliflower or an orange? Like, you're not even comparing in the same category. So you could say, well, cauliflower I like in the vegetable world and orange I like in the fruit world, whatever, right? But in terms of popularity, the Monkees were hugely significant, particularly around 67. So exciting times here. So you're going to learn about that. You're going to learn about power pop, which was in a previous edition of the book. I kept it in the online materials, so you're going to learn about that. You may hear some songs that you're familiar with. Power pop itself is a term that's coined by Pete Townsend. You can see him on the shelf right there behind me, who is the main figure writing-wise for The Who. And he kind of came up with that term, which power pop kind of had the energy and power of a lot of rock that was coming out, but it also had great melodies and more of the pop sensibility and the shaping of the music, okay? And then you're going to learn about the revival of American blues. So what happens is, the blues is an American thing. It kind of wanes as R&B becomes more popular. The blues rises in popularity in England, and then it causes a resurgence of the blues here in the United States. And that's where you get people like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, and both of those artists will come back in another chapter as well. And so you're going to start to learn about how the blues had a revival here in the United States. So I'm going to give you a heads up. On one of your assignments, it's going to say, how did the British invasion influence American music? And it's those last three things that I just told you about, okay? So make sure that you understand that when you're going in. I think that's it for now. I think we're good. Have a great week. Do your work. Get things done on time. Reach out if you need to. Take good care, and we'll talk soon.